Hi there. Welcome to Mushroom Hour. Today on Mushroom Hour, we are blessed to have the opportunity to interview Daniel Winkler. Daniel is the author of Edible Mushrooms of the Pacific Northwest in California, Amazon Mushrooms, and a brand new Field Guide to Medicinal Mushrooms of North America with Robert Rogers. Daniel grew up collecting and eating wild mushrooms in the Alps and has been foraging for over 20 years in the Pacific Northwest and beyond, sharing his enthusiasm as a mushroom educator and guide and as the Puget Sound Mycological Society vice president. With his presentations, he combines stunning photography with an often funny blend of entertaining stories and scientific information that he likes to refer to as edutainment. In the last decade, Daniel started exploring neotropical fungi, and with his travel agency, Mushrooming. Daniel has been organizing mushroom-focused eco-adventures across the world since 2007, and his research on different species of Cordyceps has been featured in The Economist, National Geographic, New York Times, Washington Post, NPR, BBC World Service, and more. When you spend some time with Daniel, I guarantee that you will be enthralled by his storytelling, and you can't help but get infected by his passion for mushrooms. Daniel, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Well, thank you so much for having it. And I don't know how your listeners will live up to all these expectations you just generated. Anyways, I'm not the vice president anymore of Puget Sound Mycological Society. I handed that on to Marion, and I'm very happy having done it and having more time to work on some other project. And the media reference you made was about the Tibetan Yartsa Gunbu, the Cordyceps that people collect in Tibet. So not about my indulging in tropical American Cordyceps.
Okay. Well, I'm excited to talk about Cordyceps in Tibet and some of the other species you've discovered, and really follow your travels as kind of an Indiana Jones explorer of mushrooms, or that's the myth of Daniel in my head, at least.
I'll be careful. There's already Taylor Lockwood claims to be the Indiana Jones of mushrooms, so I don't want to poach in his mythology here.
Got it. Okay, we'll have to think of another mythological explorer name to aptly describe Daniel's adventures here. But you know where I always like to start with people is get a little insight into their story, who they are, where they came from. And this can be as abridged as you want it to be. We don't have to go all the way back to the beginning. But I do want to hear a little bit about, your upbringing, maybe family life or education, and how those things may have played a role in stoking your interest for mushrooms, maybe nature in general. And actually, in particular for you, I think there is an interesting backstory about your early relationship with mushrooms.
Yeah, I mean, it's often hard to imagine for many Americans or general people in British informed cultures that you grow up in a family that goes mushroom hunting. In many cultures, that's a very common thing, and parents just take their kids along, and as kids, it's such a great thing to do with little kids. They just love to be out in nature and love looking for things, and often they can totally keep up with the parents finding stuff and even outdoing them because they got these really sharp eyes close to the ground. Foraging is something we've been doing as a species for millions forever. I mean, that's how we make a living as an organism, feeding on the next organism. So picking mushrooms is something that's been done for time immemorial. It's not something you need to, coffee or beer or wine, even chocolate, dark chocolate, it's an acquired taste. That's not something that comes natural. You got to get used to it, exposed to it, and you got to believe in that stuff. Otherwise, you're not really getting there. So, okay, what do people get out of that bitter stuff, or whatever? So anyways, you take your kids mushroom hunting in the forest and they love it. And so I was just out with my family, big family, 5 siblings, and we were out in the woods in the Alps. And hey, what you do especially with energetic kids, you take them out in the woods, you wear them out. And my parents didn't know that much about mushrooms, but maybe, through the years, a dozen edible species. And of course, the usual stuff like chanterelles and steinpilz, king boletes, and big parasols, Macrolepiota procera. Really, that was the mushroom I actually loved as a kid. So the boletes and the chanterelles, I liked the sauce my mom was cooking with it. But the mushiness of the mushrooms turned me off, as most kids get unfortunately turned off.
The texture, right?
But, frying up these parasols, oh man, I love them. And actually the first time I probably was a mushroom guide I was like 6 or 7 years old. And it was first or second grade elementary school. And I was out with a family of a school buddy. And I talked them into picking parasol mushrooms. And I really hope they double checked once we got home.
Right.
But I remember how we cooked them up in the kitchen and everybody enjoyed them. So that was the mushroom I liked as a kid. And, for the other stuff, it took a few more years that I enjoyed them. And of course, we knew that there's deadly mushrooms out there. We would make jokes about it. We made for a Christmas presents, we would collect hawk wings, sarcodon these days, which is usually a spruce associate out here. And then we would turn that into a spice. And that was before we had like a spice grinder in the kitchen and everything was easily done in 30 seconds. Now we were sitting there and chopping them in these tiny, tiny pieces and then made that a Christmas present, and gave that to uncles and whatever, aunts and so on. And they, of course, would ask, is that some poisonous mushroom? And in cultures where people are much more in tune with mushrooms, there's awareness of dangers too. But, it's just like in a mobile society, we all get in our cars and we know death happens every minute out on our highways. And doesn't mean we don't get in our cars. And I keep insisting, I think mushroom hunting is dangerous, especially driving into the forests. Be aware you could get killed on the highway. You have to be careful.
The most dangerous part of mushroom hunting may be the trip to get there. I think that's an interesting viewpoint too, just to talk about how many cultures where mushroom hunting is something you do from a very young age, and that actually Anglican-centric culture here in the West may be more of an outlier in that we don't do that. And I do think that it could be a really useful tool for parents. And this is me getting on my own soapbox as I evangelize all my family members who have kids, is I think it is a really good tool for parents to get kids out into nature, get them that balance, let them work off their excess energy, and also let them kind of tap into that tens of thousands year old wiring in the human body and in the human brain that comes from going out in nature and foraging and finding something and activating all those dopamine receptors and all those things that happen when you find a beautiful mushroom out in the woods. So I think, we may be missing out on not having that as part of our culture. And I'm always
big time. I mean, that's what fungophobia is, the fear of mushrooms, British heritage. And we got to be aware of it. And yes, on one level, it definitely will save some lives. But on the other side, it takes so much away and it reduces who we can be. And it reduces our relationship to nature. I mean, as organisms, we have to feed, as awful as that reality is, because often it's in conflict with our compassion. But, living, supporting your own body means that you kill. And some people get very upset about killing animals, but somehow killing plants or mushrooms, people don't see the act of violence here. And it's an awful reality of having a body is that we are there to feed on the next creature out there.
Well, I definitely see your point of view. I myself am a vegan, but we can save that whole debate for another podcast. We can save the whole debate for another podcast, but I definitely see what you're saying. And I do agree that mushroom foraging early in life can definitely inculcate that connection with nature in a way that's so much healthier for kids nowadays, especially when you think how many kids get screen time and they're addicted to the devices. It's almost mandatory they're going to have to be out in nature for a couple hours a day to balance that out. So that's kind of your cultural background. The love of mushrooms is ingrained in you on a cellular level. But I was also interested to hear about your actual academic studies and how you transitioned then to becoming an ecologist and studying Tibet and China, which is quite a different culture than where you were raised. So just talk us through that journey of becoming an ecologist and why you got so interested in the Tibet and China.
I studied geography, mostly physical geography, and in the 80s. And luckily back then there was still a lot of freedoms in how to put together your studies. And so I indulged in soils and botany and just everything out there in nature I was excited about. Didn't go the animal direction. On the other side, I always liked traveling, and then I went with my twin brother to Nepal and hiked in the Himalayas and was just blown away and fell in love with that region of the world, which on one side is so exotic, but on the other side, if you're high enough in the Himalayas or in Tibet, in the Tibetan areas, you're back into conifer forests or oak pine forests or all the aspen, whatever. So juniper, all these trees we have in the Northern Hemisphere all around the world. And so on one side, it was a very exotic place, but on the other side, I felt completely at home in the environment. I mean, in the first moment, you sit somewhere in a spruce forest and you don't know, where am I? Is this maybe the Pacific Northwest? Is this the European Alps? Or am I in some Tibetan conifer forest? And then, okay, you start looking around. And of course, as soon as you meet people, you would know. But
that gives it away.
Environment, the similarities are quite striking. Very different species often, but the dominant genera, a lot of overlap. So I fell in love with Tibetan Buddhism. That helped, definitely inspired me working on my interest for the region. And so it wasn't just on the ecological level, but also on a philosophical, spiritual level that I was intrigued by High Asia. And then in my studies, I bent my interest of ecology, forests, natural resources, and so on towards the Himalayas and Tibet, and also on another track focused on local resource management, resource development, and so on, with the intention of working with these communities. And that's how I ended up, how the mushrooms came into play at some point. I was working on community-involved reforestation in the Tibetan areas, which China opened up in the 80s and late 80s, then, in 90s, Tibetan areas were suddenly accessible too. I mean, they're not anymore for research or cooperation, but then there was a window to do research in these areas, and I used that. And whenever working on rural income issues, I would ask, so how do you make your money? What's your livelihood? And then it always came back to fungi, because the main source of rural income in the Tibetan areas is always catepillar fungus. And okay, if you're in a high desert environment, that's too dry. And if you in very deep valleys that are too warm, there's no cordyceps. But as soon as you are on the typical lush Tibetan grazing grounds, somewhere up in 12,000 feet, up to 15,000 feet, so that's around tree line. A little bit above tree line, around tree line, there's catepillar fungus as part of the ecosystem, and everybody who can is out there collecting. And when I first saw it in 97, I was clueless. I had no idea what that was. And my Tibetan coworker tells me, oh, this is a summer warm winter grass. And I look at this thing and, okay, the base, that could be a piece of wood, but once you clean it, it does look like a larva. And the upper part, so this traditional name didn't make much sense. So I came home and researched that stuff. And back then there was very little information out there. I mean, the internet hadn't taken off in any way. And then I, for years, I started to really improve Wikipedia and filter out and get rid of the vegetable wasp stuff, which New Zealandish perspective used these absurd terminology. I said, sorry, there's neither vegetable nor a wasp involved here. This is that was Cordyceps, was under that name on Wikipedia. And I think after I bugged them for a year or 2 years, they finally changed it to Cordyceps. So
now, were there people within that region that had an intimate understanding of the Cordyceps you were dealing with? I mean, it sounds like you were one of the first kind of Westerners that interfaced with Cordyceps and were trying to identify it. But did people there, whether in academic circles or other circles, already have an intimate knowledge of this?
Absolutely. I mean, it's such a central issue it took off in the 2000s. And of course, there was always mycologists or Chinese medicine people who combined their traditional knowledge with the scientific knowledge. And they had a clear idea what that organism was. But the West didn't really know anything about it. There was 1 or 2 papers, like I think Pegler was one of the guys who worked with a couple Chinese and introduced it in the early 90s or so. But there was very little out. And of course, any society, if it's a traditional medicine, people have an idea. But to expect, I mean, people were going by their traditional knowledge. And there was a worm visible. And the grass reference, there's a sedge that has a very similar flower and fruiting body to the stroma of caterpillar fungus.
Oh, so that
was a good analogy, and it made sense. And I think we still, if we just talk about Cordyceps sinensis, I like to call it Tibetan caterpillar fungus. The Chinese in the name was Berkeley, in the 19th century, who had no idea that this fungus came from the Tibetan plateau. He got a specimen from a Chinese market that was already back then exported from the Tibetan area. So that's why he called it sinensis, and which is Latinized Chinese. The Tibetan name is Yartsa Gunbu, and Yartsa Gunbu, this summer warm winter grass, really reflects the 2 stages. We have a caterpillar, or actually it's a larva because it lives underground, is basically hairless, lives underground, feeds off roots of plants, and then we have a fungus that infects it. And just to call it by the infection doesn't make much sense, but that's just how it goes at this point.
Well, it's interesting you say, too, that it originated really in Tibetan culture, and coupling that with the understanding that this biome region, this higher elevation forest that you said is different but quite similar to other biomes around the world when you talk about higher elevation spruce forest. Is there something special about the ecology of that area in Tibet that made it the perfect environment for Cordyceps sinensis? Was it just evolutionary dumb luck that it only seems to appear here? Why is this not showing up at some of those other high elevation forests that may seem similar?
Okay, so the forest, I should correct that it shows up once in a while in open forests. But since the larva feeds off grasses, perennials, forbs, herbs, it's not a forest creature.
It's not a forest fungi. Okay, so that correcting my own.
No, but it's in. I found some of them in open forests. Like high up when the forest density is reduced, and it's usually grazing animals that kill the forest. Then you'll find it too. So it's a grassland phenomena. Yeah, for years I struggled with this whole non-timber forest products. This is often where these things get classified. FAO, the World Food and Agriculture Organization, would do all that kind of research under non-timber forest products. So I came up with non-dairy livestock products or non-dairy grassland products. It never took off. It's awkward enough, the non-timber forest products, but that's for the foresters who we want the timber. Oh, there's something else in the woods besides timber? No, that can't be. And then people wrote these papers about non-timber forest products, which is mushrooms, of course, but It's also resins. If you collect resins from trees, and it can be honey, wild honey, it can be berries, and so on. So
a pretty huge, non-specific, really economically derived term, right? It's kind of lumping
human
things
use, by human use.
Yes.
Derived. Yes. So back to our non-livestock grassland product. I don't have an answer if specifically it only could have happened on the Tibetan plateau.
Right.
On one level, I don't think so. We do have these cordyceps-like fungi, these insect parasitizing fungi we have all around the world. But I don't think we have anywhere else we have a density of a population like the Tibetan catepillar fungus. That is really unique. And, you go into any tropical rainforest and you will find a whole bunch of cordyceps, but the dominance of one species is not there. And that's, of course, big difference often between temperate and tropical ecosystems. Species diversity is so much higher in the tropics. So
Right.
that's definitely a factor. And I think, the easiest would say it's the blessing of the Buddhas who gave to the Tibetans such a precious...
That's what I was waiting for. I was waiting for the Buddhist spiritual connection to why these cordyceps manifested.
Well, it's not that easy because traditionally it's taboo collecting caterpillar fungus.
Really? So it's considered, and right now we're kind of getting into that such interesting field of ethnomycology, which is a huge field, but basically people's interaction with mushrooms and how the anthropocentric uses of them, how they've affected human society.
Yeah.
So it was actually taboo for Tibetans to pick the caterpillar fungus. Why?
There's stigma with it. Yeah. The idea, the Tibetan perception is the caterpillar, the larva correctly, is still alive. So you digging up the ground to extract a creature you're killing. So digging up the ground is already the first thing you're not supposed to do in proper Tibetan Buddhist culture. You will see on every field in the middle is a stone where offerings are made to the spirits of the soil. This is nothing that is Buddhist per se. That's a pre-Buddhist relation to the environment. Which has its really nice aspects because people behave better if they don't regard themselves as the lone owners or controller of a piece of the world. If they know we have to share and we have to be careful, and if we don't behave well, if we dig up soil, respectlessness without asking for permission to do it, we might get sick from it. We will be cursed with diseases. So this is a traditional perspective. And it has been a big challenge for the Tibetan community to make peace with this traditional taboo. It's not okay to pick it. And the economic reality that there is no resource like that and everybody does it. And you make money that doesn't compare to anything a regular person in Tibet can make. And so one of the compromises is that people would not pick on sacred days. In the Tibetan Buddhist calendar, there would be new moon, full moon, and 5 days before full moon and new moon, a specific Sunday function in the Buddhist calendar, especially holy days. They wouldn't collect any. And then there's a lot of offering done, which is already a big part of Tibetan Buddhist tradition, or Buddhist tradition in Asia. You could be a little cynical and say, any form of offering of generosity is investment because you're creating good karma by sharing. And there is an inner conflict for practicing Buddhists in Tibet collecting it. But in the end, the money won out and there's a construct to live with it. And caterpillar fungus is collected by basically everyone, but often it's not collected around sacred sites. It's not easy as a monk or a nun engaging in that would be very frowned upon.
Well, and that's where spirituality and economics often clash, one subsuming the other. In some cultures, economic considerations get subsumed by spiritual considerations and spiritual practice. In this case, it sounds like there was some necessary integration because the economic forces were so hugely impactful to the population there. And just to get into this a little bit, if you do know the history, for how long has this been economically significant? And then who were the people that wanted the cordyceps? Because there's a mythology out there about, this was the emperor's medicine, that it was revered by Chinese royalty and elites, as far back as recorded history goes. I wonder if you can shine a little light on kind of how this was originally brought into that economic marketplace. And then today, maybe how that's changed or who the different customers are now.
Yeah. So the collection goes back for centuries. The first Tibetan record of Yartsa Gunbu is in the 16th, 15th, 16th century. It's been all years now that I worked on that. And my twin brother is a Tibetologist. So he had studied Tibetan language. He translated for me the first known Tibetan text that uses the term catepillar.
You have a twin brother that also loves Tibet. You guys are a dynamic duo. That's amazing.
Well, it was really perfect for working on caterpillar fungus. And then we knew Tibetan medical practitioners who had paid a little attention to it already because it's such a big deal in Tibet. And so we were quickly steered to the first official known document using that name. And then my brother translated it, and I could help with my ecological insight, and he would have people who would help in certain other aspects. And I published it and in 2008 in International Association of Tibetan Studies proceedings, where the translation of the text is there. So there's a long history in Tibetan culture. The market is driven by Chinese demand. Tibetan economy was never integrated in Chinese economy. I mean, these cultures, these countries lived side by side, didn't value each other often very highly. The Chinese looked down upon the Tibetans as these dirty, superstitious people high up there in the mountain, uncivilized, of course. And the Tibetans thought these Chinese are these materialists. Everything is always about money. They called them the black people because they were wearing these dark blue clothing. And the Indians were the white people because they were wearing white cotton, and there's already quite a bias in that terminology. Everything good in Tibet always came from India. That's where Buddhism came from, right?
Right.
So the Chinese already were into certain forms of cordyceps at least 1,500 years ago. So there's records undoubtable from the 4th, 5th century showing cordyceps growing out of a cicada. And some people point to cicada stones made in jade 2,000 years ago, but there's no cordyceps growing out of it. So just because it's a cicada doesn't allow...
I want to make that connection too, but yeah, that's not necessarily definitive.
So the Chinese were using cordyceps products medicinally for quite a while and were fond of them. So the Tibetan and the Chinese use were not really connected. Tibetan medicine, Soa Rigpa, is really much, much more influenced by Indian Ayurveda. Okay. I mean, a lot of it is ancient Tibetan medical knowledge too, but you read a modern Chinese book about Tibetan medicine, it's always a branch of Chinese medicine, but that's not how it developed. You're not going to get published in China unless you present your work in that way. And then in the 17th century or so, that's the first records we have, late 17th century, the first records we have of the Chinese becoming aware of Tibetan caterpillar fungus.
Okay.
And then the export started. And there's records out of the 19th century where they talk about supposedly 10 tons being shipped through the Tibetan town of Dartsedo, which turned into Tachinlu and is now Kangding, which now is, I don't know how many 100,000, mostly Chinese and a few Tibetans living in a narrow mountain valley at the transition between Sichuan, China, Han China, and the Tibetan areas high up. And so 10 tons back then, I mean, there was already millions and millions of caterpillar fungi.
I was going to say, I can't even conceive of 10 tons of cordyceps.
Yeah. So if that figure has any value, and, I got that out of a Chinese history. Somebody tipped me off that in a book on the history of Sichuan, they were referring to such and such a document. Now, I'm not a sinologist that I checked into the authenticity of these documents and all of that. So, but, I put that out in 2008, and I'm sure hundreds of Chinese researchers have written my paper, and I have not seen anybody refuting it and saying, this is a really bad source. How did you fall for it? No wonder nobody has challenged it in that way. But
right.
as a trained geographer, I mean, I like just to see things from as many perspectives as possible. As a geographer, okay, there's always that spatial thing, but I'm just curious. And ethnomycology is so beautiful because you look at the people, you look at the culture, you have the mushroom, the fungi, but you also have the ecosystem and environment. So I did the whole circle of all these things over the year, and then the markets. So the socioeconomics of it. And in 2006, I went with a Tibetan Chinese colleague. We went from county to county and prefectural town to prefectural town and talked to the people in the forest offices or agriculture about caterpillar fungus. And these people were blown away. They had numbers collected and said how many tons, 3.5 tons is collected in our county. They had these numbers, but they never multiplied the number with the value, with the price that's paid on the street for it. And so in Chamdo, we were sitting there with, I don't know, he was high up official and his secretary, and he started barking at her. How come we have a foreigner telling us these numbers here? And you never gave me these numbers, you know? I mean, like 50 million yuan generated each year through collection of caterpillar fungus.
They didn't even necessarily know the modern economic impact that the caterpillar fungus.
They saw it. They saw the market. They knew it's very valuable. I mean, any visiting Chinese official was treated to caterpillar fungus. The government in Tibetan Autonomous Region bought up over many years 20-30% of the annual harvest and would give that to any visiting Chinese official. That I was told by the dealer who sold most of it. So that in that situation, the governor or the head of agriculture, he was so upset with his secretary, and he said, well, I give you these numbers each year, you know, you see how much is produced, you know how precious that stuff is. I mean, don't lay the blame on me. So I put all these numbers together, calculated it, and then sat over it a long time, because in most of these counties, suddenly the annual harvest was 130% of the gross domestic product. And of course, that can't be. So, and I took that way too serious and thorough. You know, it was just underreported. And all these counties were receiving poverty elevation as being super poor counties. But then you look at the caterpillar fungus number and the local income generated, it's like none of them would have qualified for that subsidy anymore.
Oh, so, I see. Well, there's an interesting economic relationship there. And you're also highlighting what I kind of caught when you're talking about giving it to visiting Chinese officials and things. This must have played a large role in diplomatic relations between Tibet and China. I mean, absolutely. For hundreds of years then.
Yeah, it did. The Dalai Lamas were always sending also caterpillar fungus to China. And there was a big trade. The Tibetans would provide horses, medicinal herbs, caterpillar fungus, and gold, also a certain amount. But then in exchange, especially for tea, silk, brocade, rice, you know. But the tea, I mean, every Tibetan drinks tea, and the tea was transported for 3-4 months across the plateau, like from Sichuan over to Lhasa. So it's been a big deal, and it really argued for the sustainability, or at least the resilience of caterpillar fungus. We have to be worried about that because everybody who can is collecting, and the intensity of collection went up incredibly. And people would tell me, elderly people, well, when I was young, we would go out there and I would find 500 a day or 1,000, you know, and now there's 1,000 people finding 5 a day. So this really has changed. But what was a big game changer, which we didn't know till 3 or 4 years ago, there's a Chinese paper published. They looked at the presence of Ophiocordyceps DNA in alpine plants. Mm-hmm. And 40% of the plants they looked at, it turned out, had fungal DNA in roots, stems, and leaves.
Now, is this getting into endophytic, potentially,
yes,
cordyceps?
Absolutely. So this cordyceps is not just infecting a larva, and it's not just the life cycle, and is not just between the larva and the fungus. It is also a plant in there. And the fungus, having this endophytic, living in a plant lifestyle, is of course perfectly protected from human predation. So very helpful to know. Even if people keep collecting and collecting, it doesn't mean the fungus necessarily disappears out of the ecosystem. Now, we don't know, does it spread through mycelia or whatever from one plant to another, through the rhizosphere maybe, right?
Or from plants to bug kind of transmission.
Well, the spores, the spores will be carried off, and some of the spores will infect other larvae.
But
does it first go into the plants, which the larvae eat?
This isn't fruiting bodies on the plants, but this is the actual genetic material in the plant.
No fruiting bodies. Like ergot, which is related, not in the same family, but same order. Ergot, which is the Cordyceps purpurea, which infects rye and kills people. And then when it falls down, it's a complex life cycle. Anyway, so backing out of that.
Backing out of that rabbit hole.
The whole new insight that it has an endophytic part in its life cycle. And that really helps reducing the fear of extinction because these plants, the animals eat the upper parts, but the roots still have it. So the fungus seems to be securely anchored in the environment besides the face in an insect.
And that was one of my key questions, was how sustainable is this? And you would imagine if we have records going back hundreds of years where they're transporting somewhere around 10 tons at a time, I think, like, how can this be sustainable? How does this keep coming back? So it would make sense that there is some part of this life cycle that's keeping it in the environment regardless of human impact. And it makes me wonder if that could happen with other fungi, potentially other cordyceps.
Looking into sustainability, I was quite optimistic. For many years, many precious medicinal substances that are collected in such intensity, it's a very, very bleak outlook. But the long history of collection, centuries of collection, and the fact that in the end, you would collect the fungus, the fruiting body on the dead insect, seemed to me that, okay, you just collect the final product. You don't interfere with earlier part of the cycle. However, climate change is a challenge because cordyceps fruiting around tree line, above tree line, needs a cold climate. And Central Asia, the Himalayas and Tibet is very impacted by climate change. It's warming up quite a bit. It's getting also a bit more humid, which is a good sign for the fungus, but it's just we can't assess. And some more recent research makes me definitely a little bit more pessimistic. I still hope and I think it will survive, our crazy phase here of human economic and population explosion. It's just such a remote, vast area, and that thing is so tiny. The mountains are really high, and there will be always some biome left for caterpillar fungus.
And maybe there's some type of cordyceps Shambhala we can help establish where to make sure they continue on without human interference here. Has this desire for Tibetan cordyceps fungus, has that been part of the reason why China is desirous of Tibet?
It's definitely part of it. The Chinese term for Tibet, Xizang, or the Zang, is the treasure house. So the characters, the symbol of the character is a treasure house. Now, because the Chinese, there's a long history of trade, as I said, medicinal plant, also some gold. So there was always a perception of these Tibetans sitting on valuable stuff they don't really appreciate. Yes, that definitely stoked some desire there.
I couldn't help. I
can
help but think of that.
The Tibetans, caterpillar fungus has integrated the Tibetan economy in China in a way hardly no other program ever did. Because the money reached into the last most remote valley. And suddenly these people now have money to buy things. And it had transformed the life of nomads. They can afford a car now. They build houses, maybe a second house, in areas where there's a lot of caterpillar fungus. They don't often collect themselves. They rent out their land. they changed, okay, let's milk our yaks a little less. Let's be more generous to the calves, because whatever you take from a yak in milk, the calves won't get. And that sheep herding was always quite intense. So they reduced their intensity of land management because now they have so much other food. And let's go to the butcher in town. Then I don't have that bad karma of slaughtering my animals. And it's incredible what it did to the whole culture and the community.
Well, it sounds like it's empowering people. It's also relieving some of the economic pressures. Now, before your journeys over there, was there any forage tourism, if you want to call it that, whether it be Chinese or people from elsewhere coming to pick the caterpillar fungus?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
There was, in some of these Tibetan counties in the 90s already, there was more Han or Hui are the Muslim Chinese, were coming into the counties than people were living there year round.
Oh, so more tourists than actual residents?
Well, not tourists. People were coming there to make the money, to collect. So as a tourism, there is still very little. It's not easy. As an outsider, you're not allowed to collect. There's permit system. So you can't just, as a Han Chinese, lowland Chinese, you can't go just to these areas and start collecting. So us being foreigners, we didn't go there to collect. Well, when I integrated that into our eco adventures, often what we would do is we would hire paid local people to take us on the slope, and then we would buy each caterpillar fungus we find, we would pay them for.
That's a
Even
good way.
if I found it or somebody of the group, we still would give them the money, and everybody was happy with that. It wasn't like, darn it, now I have to pay them. No, it's like, it also generated a lovely quid pro quo, It's like we weren't just coming there and checking out your resources and taking, but we were partaking in their life, in what they were doing each year for 6 weeks up there, above tree line, collecting in the cold or the intense sun and so on.
Almost sounds less touristy and more really trying to integrate into their culture for a little while and see what it's like.
Yeah, absolutely. But then there was places where somebody just came up to us and said, no foreigners allowed, and no outsiders allowed to pick. And then you get invited maybe in the tent and have tea with the poor officials that are sent up there above tree line to, along the roads, that is, to supervise everything. And you still get a nice treatment, but they let us know very clearly, you were half an hour out here, an hour up on the pasture and took some pictures. Now, move on. And,
I'm sure on all the eco adventures, there's a little bit of that managing local administration, local culture, maybe taboos, things like that. But I do want to talk more about these different eco adventures. So this is mush roaming. And where are some of the other places that you take people on these? I know I can't call them Indiana Jones style adventures. I get it. It's taken. But where do you take people on these foraging adventures? Because you go all over the planet.
So I started out as a sideline adventure and income to my environmental work in Tibet. I did tour guiding there.
Yeah.
So other companies would ask me, hey, would you have time? Would you guide our group? And so I got into the whole tourist thing. And when I started out, I always was an independent traveler, backpacker, and so out there. Back then, no, I never would hire a porter in Nepal and so on. I have to carry my own. And now I understand, well, hiring a porter is actually a great service to the local economy. And then I started to take people interested in mushrooms there with the knowledge I had and the local contacts I had made. I mean, I'm my best customer. I just really love what I do. And since I had already 10 years experience in the Tibetan areas and these good contacts. And then the next 5 years, I only focused on these fungal eco adventures in the Tibetan areas and would move it around each year to some areas I know, some I didn't know. So always loved that mixture out of know a place already and then do the new stuff. And it's always, timing is such a important part of all of this. And climate change is a real challenge. The rainy seasons are just not as reliable anymore. But we had only one time a mushrooming tour in July in eastern Tibet, Sichuan these days, where it rained a little in the beginning and then it was on dry, but suddenly we saw all these incredible mountains and in shady valleys there was still some mushrooms. And on the markets, we would still get some. But otherwise, it's very unusual that you would get sunny 2 weeks or so.
And when is the season in Tibet for the Cordyceps Sinensis we've been talking about?
So the Cordyceps Yartsa Gunbu is a spring fruiting fungus. It's like same as the morel season, more or less. But the main fruiting season on the Tibetan plateau in the Himalayas, as all over East Asia and Southeast Asia, is monsoon, summer monsoon. So we're looking at usually at the months June, July, August, September. It overlaps with a lot of mushroom seasons in the Northern Hemisphere. Central America and Mexico and so on has also these summer rains. And then, of course, the East Coast. Out on the West Coast, things are quite different. These are the dry months and where rains are the exception. So that was part also about looking into doing this mushrooming somewhere else since, I love doing it so much. And I mean, yes, I started out with 3 people, 4 people, 6 people, 8 people was a big group, which is really nice. Also these smaller groups and the people it attracts. I worked for several other travel outfits and I get along with everybody. I mean, that's part of, you got to look at the good side in people and focus on that. But the filter of looking for mushrooms was just great, especially, in North America, because it is so much more a quirky, geeky, niche thing. Eccentric, interesting people who checked out so many things in life already till they hit the mushrooms. While mushroom hunters in Germany, in France, in Italy, in the Slavic countries, this is mainstream. It doesn't compare to our really colorful scene out here.
That's a great viewpoint that I haven't had before, is that the North American mycophile community, because it's a niche subculture, filters through only the most interesting and eccentric people. And that was one of my questions for you was, what kind of people are coming on these trips? Is it all ages? Is it mostly just seasoned backpackers and mycophiles? And where are they coming from? And it sounds like you're dealing with a quirky, eccentric fun.
Well, the majority of people, I'd say, is retired. The reality of US capitalism, where people have hardly any vacations. Average age, I would guess, is usually in the 60s. Sometimes there's some kids in their 20s or 30s, but I'm 55 now. Often I'm within the 1 or 2 or 3 youngest. But then it's also nice to hear, you have a 23-year-old on the trip and say, sometimes it was more like traveling like with my grandparents, but cool grandparents out here, So there is generation gap there, but it's a lot of people who stayed young in their hearts and minds. And so I was doing these tours in the Tibetan areas. Then Larry Evans kept telling me, hey, dude, you got to go to the Amazon. And there's all these cordyceps diversity out there. And I did mushrooming tours for him for a few years, Ecuador and Bolivia. And he had connections there. And that opened doors. And I learned a lot about tropical mushrooms from him. And that helped. And I mean, I was hooked, just the diversity. In Tibet, you can find in the right place, you can find 20, 30, 40 cordyceps on a really good day. Sometimes it could be maybe 5 or 10 or 1, but it's always the same species. And you go in the rainforest and you might find on some days 1 or 2 and then other days 5, but different species.
That's what's so interesting to me about the Amazonian trips. And anyone who already follows you or has visited mushrooming knows that you are prodigious and really a talented photographer. Love your photography, your showcasing of all your finds as you go on these journeys. But when you see some of these cordyceps from the Amazon, they are incredibly striking. They're alien life forms. I mean, some of these things are just wild. So, I know we've already been talking for a while and we've really covered a lot about Tibet and China. So we don't have to go into every aspect of the Amazon and every cordyceps, but I guess if you can highlight a couple of the most interesting or some of your favorite cordyceps finds down there and just a general idea of how much unknown territory there still is.
Oh, each year we find some new cordyceps, and I'm not the one who would know it's a new cordyceps. So I do a lot of stuff together with my friend Tatiana San Juan from Bogota. And she got her PhD working on cordyceps, on neotropical, so nootropic cordyceps. she really has the overview, what's out there, what has been described, does really good work. And luckily, she doesn't take as good pictures as I do.
So Daniel has a role as the explorer and the photographer.
A role, and I don't need to totally take off into taxonomy. My patience is not really there. And the diversity is just so much higher in any tropical ecosystem. And there's so many insects in the rainforest. And it's not all insects that get infected, but, cicadas, ants. There's a stickbug cordyceps I finally saw for the first time this March. In southern Colombia, Ecuador, there's spiders get infected. Oh man, there's incredible spider cordyceps out there. Sometimes they get infected in a trapdoor, so they sit in these cocoon sacs underground, that could be 2 inches long or 4 inches long in that sac, and then it has a lid up there, and that lid, made all with spider webbing, is camouflaged with, you can't see it. It's the same debris that's on the forest floor.
No, these are like the spiders of my nightmares, the trapdoor spiders.
Yeah, so luckily you're big enough that you don't have to worry. But, if other insects go in front of that trapdoor or small mammals, it's tarantula relatives, they come out and get them. But then the cordyceps get them in their transitional phases, when they shed their exoskeleton and go about 12 stages before they reach full size. And during that shedding, they are sensitive, susceptible to infection. And then some cordyceps get them. And then, the only thing coming out of this trapdoor is the fruiting body, a bright red fruiting body of a cordyceps.
Are there any medicinal uses for some of these neotropical cordyceps? Is it still relatively unknown?
We have no idea. So the thing is, there was no traditional use of cordyceps. Tatiana came across people in Choco in Western Colombia down at the Pacific who were using lianas for tying their roofs symbolically, where cordyceps were attaching themselves. The ants were biting into these lianas and then being killed off by the cordyceps. So they were thinking that was a symbol of the strength of the liana. And so they were tying the roof construction more symbolical with these to give endurance and, lasting to the household and so on. But otherwise, we have not heard about any use of cordyceps. We don't know any medicinal propensities. There's a guy in Peru who is working on it and who wants to sell Peruvian cordyceps as a big medicinal, but there's no track record so far. Good luck to him, but I guess you need a whole bunch of studies when you want to make sure there's no toxicity, that it actually has functions. And yes, you could look for cordycepine, the most famous active ingredient,
right,
and you might have a cordycepine content and market it on that level, but you need these toxicity studies, which, if you do it the proper way, is really expensive. So would be interesting, but many of these tropical cordyceps, there is not the density of population that you really make a living collecting now these ant cordyceps or so.
You don't find hundreds in one place.
No,
where
none
you
of
could
the
really
same
have a big,
stuff.
You're not going to see 10 tons of the same. I really love the ethno-mycological angle. So that's interesting. One of the only uses you've found for some of these is an architectural use, which I wouldn't think of. But nowadays, with the big North American shroom boom, and everyone wants cordyceps. Right. They want cordyceps as the medicinal in everything. I couldn't help but wonder if some of these novel cordyceps you're finding are going to be the kind of that next wave of, let's look at these green.
I would think that still takes quite some time. And interestingly, also the cordyceps you buy here, unless it's Cordyceps militaris, which was not used as a medicinal for centuries or anything, it has a very recent history. The Chinese started using it some decades ago as a cheap substitute for the Tibetan caterpillar fungus.
Oh, okay.
And actually what you buy here in the stores as Cordyceps sinensis is not Ophiocordyceps sinensis. It is an organism, it's a fungus, it's part of the ecosystem of that fungus, but it is not Ophiocordyceps sinensis. So it is mislabeled, but it contains cordycepine. And a lot of the medical research has been done actually with this fungus and not with the real thing.
So the Cordyceps Sinensis has some kind of, I don't know if it's like symbiotic relationship, what you're saying there, with another kind of fungus that is actually...
you and I, we are ecosystem, right? I mean, look, you have more cells in your system that are not Homo sapiens than Homo sapiens.
Right, okay? Right. Yeah, mostly especially viruses and bacteria.
Yeah, right, yeah. Exactly. So if you dig up the Yartsa Gunbu, that insect fungus, the infected insect larva, okay?
Yeah.
And then you look what kind of organisms are there. So yes, the dominant thing will be the DNA of the larva and Ophiocordyceps Sinensis, but there's all kinds of other fungi, bacteria, and all of this is around there. And the Chinese did a lot of intense research because they wanted to cultivate it.
Yes.
And didn't succeed for decades cultivating it. Now they're there. But what the Chinese were selling in the 80s cultures, they called Cordyceps Sinensis, that turned out not to be it. So it might be a Bacillomyces, it might be a Tulipocladium, something that is related, but it's not the same thing. And that's what it's easy to cultivate in big scale, but it's not Ophiocordyceps Sinensis.
And this is primarily for, supplements that use kind of myceliated grain. You wouldn't be able to tell the difference of whether you had Sinensis or something else that's in its
I wouldn't say you couldn't. We don't know because we don't see the actual fungus really here. You can go out in Chinatown and usually it's hidden and try to get it, or you could try to find it online. But it is a different fungus in trade that is labeled Cordyceps Sinensis. So it's a different strain, it's a different species. And when you go really deep in web pages of these producers, you'll find, first they might say it's exactly the same. And then further down, it's a very complicated taxonomic situation. And it might be a Bacillomyces or so. The DNA of Cordyceps Sinensis was wrong on Microbank or whatever, where you deposit your DNA, because they took it from the culture and not from the wild organism.
Oh, that's so interesting. So a lot of the wild cultures being sold aren't necessarily the same caterpillar fungus organism. That leads a huge insight.
Nobody sells the real thing. No. Wow. It grows, true anamorph, Hirsutella sinensis, grows much slower. You never can grow on the scale you can grow what is sold under the name. It's CS4 is the strain.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's so funny because as people get more into Cordyceps militaris, I see a lot of comparisons of medicinal compounds from now what I'm going to call quote unquote Cordyceps sinensis, the CS4 strain, and Cordyceps militaris. And so we're not really comparing apples to apples. You can't say definitively that militaris has this superior level of cordycepin than real true Cordyceps sinensis.
Yeah, no, you can compare it to CS4 because that's the strain everybody is growing. And yes, some people say we have a hybrid of this or that, but all the medical research also has been done. Very few research has been done with the wild collected Ophiocordyceps sinensis. It's much more expensive. It's more tedious. And, cultivated stuff. And people always like also the reliability. It's from a culture. This could be a whole different.
We're getting deep. This could be a different mushroom hour. Well, I hope to have you back for a few more because I know we just scratched the surface. But why don't you tell us where people can find mushrooming and how people can get involved? Obviously, once things settle out and we're all traveling again, how can people get involved with mushrooming? Where can they find you?
Oh, they find me online when they look for mushrooming and overrule their spell check. And except there's a OA in there for roaming for mushrooms. And usually in the last years, I organized 2 tours, one to Colombia with Tatiana, and the other one I've been doing in Bhutan. So escaping the Chinese reality of travel in Tibet, really enjoying being in Bhutan, and also been doing some project work there regarding edible mushrooms. Yeah, mushrooming, and I have, thousands of pictures on there. They're all subtitled, and I'm very happy. Try always to update, correct. It's a continuous process of learning, and I also can see through the years how my pictures get better. I started out with very average images and learned and partially thinking I got to reduce my photography. It takes up way too much time. Photo stacking is painstakingly slow, and it just takes so much time. But hey, I really enjoy the outcome and these really focused, crisp images that come out. And online, I have only small versions of it. So I have the 100 kilobyte and not the 10 megabyte pictures, which is just mind-blowing, all the details you can see. So anyways, mushrooming, I have lots of galleries out there from all these trips, and just send me an email. And right now, of course, travel is difficult, and we had great luck that we could still do our tour in March in Colombia.
Yeah, that is lucky you got that in there before all the travel was shut down.
We got in there and we got out 2 days before they were closing the country. And we did not bring any diseases either. So that was all very lucky. So
wow. I will say that the one mushroom hunt I was able to go on with you here in Mendocino, California, while photography may be kind of painstaking, you left me with that idea that, hey, even when you don't find edible mushrooms, you can always eat the mushrooms with your eyes.
Absolutely.
And I've taken that away, and I've stolen that phrase many a time and used it for people, but it's very true. It's like developing the skill in photography when it comes to mushrooms, such a natural outgrowth of the passion or the hobby, because you can capture these things that may not have any other use or may not last that long, as you can get a great photo of it.
And you see things, once you have it on your screen, you can see things you don't really see in the field. I even found in 2 of my Amazon mushroom pictures, I found Cordyceps at home on the computer because I was taken by a much bigger mushroom. And wait a minute, what's that in the back? Oh, darn it, there's a Cordyceps I didn't find. So,
wow, that's incredible. I love that. I guess we didn't really talk about your books, but obviously you've got amazing books, including a book you did with Robert Rogers.
They are laminated fold out, so people don't get a wrong idea. But
they're field guides.
They're field guides, so they're very handy, the right thing to take along when you don't want to load yourself down, and focusing on the edibles, of course, out here. And then for the Amazon, it's the most commonly seen things and the most important medicinal. So I really like boiling things down to the important information and travel myself with a whole bunch of these fold out guides. The details I can get later, but I want to know right there in the field. Is this it? Is it not? Is it close? Never thought I end up doing these things, but I enjoy it, and I will move on to contain much more information in the future. But I learned so much doing these things, and I wished I could retain it all, but I don't. But I try to, and I enjoy very much also getting steered into new directions. Things where I'm for a while quite shy and, no, I don't really want to go down that hole. And then, finally the right person comes up. I mean, it's really people inspire me to do certain things, and you'll meet them in your life. When you're ready, there's the right person, and I can go in a new direction.
Yeah, well, and it feels like with a lot of your work, you've really followed your passion and your interests. And what I like to say is you haven't got in the way of what your heart wants to do by getting too much in your head. And maybe you can correct me here, but it sounds like you were interested in certain areas of the world. I'm going to go there. I'm going to explore it. I'm going to study it. Oh, I want to go and explore mushrooms now in different parts of the world. I'm going to arrange trips. I mean, has your path been a lot about following your passion and not getting too much in your own way?
Yes, I'm very lucky that I can do that, and finding ways how to do it. As I say, I'm my best customer, right? I make sure that people don't feel that way when we're out there, but I share my enthusiasm. And it was even years that I didn't really realize how great a service I offer by organizing all the travel stuff, because I always used to travel and, you go here, you go there, and then things work out. But group travel, you got to have all your hotel books, transportations, and I want certain standards. And you're there with interesting people, you have knowledgeable guides, and you can just do so much more interesting things in a shorter time than when, I'm out there myself and I'm flowing with whatever circumstances come upon. That's really important. And a key part of traveling is always being open to the unexpected, whatever comes next. That's the essence of travel. There's opportunities arising and follow that. But still, hey, it's nice to know where you sleep at night, right? And I do expect sometimes people, okay, sorry, there's no lunch, everybody brings whatever,
right,
some snack or so. We're not going to sacrifice this experience now because it's 1:00 and it's lunchtime. Sorry.
When you're exploring the frontiers of mycology, you might miss a lunch. There are certain sacrifices. That are made.
Right. And they're not painful. And, we are prepared. And often we also take picnics and so on that we don't need to be back in civilization for lunch and so on.
Especially right now, this all sounds like an absolute delight. And I can't wait until I have the opportunity to go on one of these trips. Hopefully in the future, I'll be able to go on one of these trips with you. And just my takeaways, it sounds like for you, passion, enthusiasm, curiosity, and then community, and being open to forming community based around really committing to what you're passionate about has shaped your experience in mycology, but probably in life. Well, I've got a couple wrap-up questions that I like to ask all my guests, just to give a deeper window into the spirit of Daniel Winkler. So what is a mushroom, if you could pick one that you love and why? It doesn't have to be a favorite, can be for any reason, but just a mushroom that you love that people may or may not have heard of and why you like it.
Oh man, there's so many mushrooms, and there's a mushroom for every day and every moment. And
exactly, it could change 5 minutes from now.
I must admit, when it comes to eating mushrooms, I love my king boletus. That's for me the best edible. And when it comes maybe to photography, it is Cordyceps, because it's just the most bizarre and the strangest. And it keeps surprising me. It's just crazy what's all out there. So yeah, if I have to limit it, maybe to 2. But I like to take pictures of all kinds of mushrooms. And if the day had 48 hours, I would love to take many more plant and insect pictures. And I'm just not so, documenting civilization, human activities. I'm not.
Focus on the natural world instead of the
natural world.
Instead of the man-made world,
where I think we need more documentation, and
especially if it's disappearing, we need to remember what it looked like. I had a mental image of 3-year-old Daniel running around the forest in Bavaria, picking king boletus. So I'm sure that one has stuck with you. And then, kind of in that vein, what would you tell an 18-year-old Daniel? What advice would you be able to leave with him?
An 18-year-old Daniel wouldn't listen anyways,
I love that answer. There's nothing I could tell 18-year-old Daniel.
I mean, I would listen, but, when we're 18, we think we know everything. And I definitely was always driven by my enthusiasm and probably also the good luck I had throughout my life, daring to do things that maybe other people wouldn't do. I always perceive myself still careful in that role. It's really what you gotta do with heart. You gotta love it. Sometimes in life we get traumatized by certain circumstances that makes it seem like a total luxury following your heart. And maybe that's then more important. So I'm not saying, risk everything, give up everything. The more you love something you do, the more you see the importance of it, the better you are. And, in a human environment, there's always hundreds of other people who try to do a very similar thing. And don't worry about them, but make sure that what you do, that you're fully behind it. And, if it's accounting, you better love numbers, and you better see the needs for accounting and what you can do with accounting and how you could improve the world with accounting, But if you only go into accounting because it's safe and makes money, you pay a big price for that. You might not worry about money, but it will take a toll on who you are. So it's not the accounting that's the issue. It's how you relate to it.
Check in with what you're doing to make sure you are somewhat in alignment with really is what your passion is and how you're relating to what you're doing.
And even, what I do when you only look at the 2 weeks where I end up in the Amazon, or maybe it's 7 days of the 2 weeks,
Yeah.
What kind of preparation it takes for me to be able to do it, to find the people who want to travel with me, to travel through the country, giving presentations, getting the word out, being my own PR department, being my own webmaster, writing up these things, working with the photos, and how much it takes just to be able to do that. So it's easily overseen what kind do you have to put into it and how things build up to a certain way. But, if you have that as an objective, persistence and a game plan. But I didn't even have the idea I end up in the Amazon. Growing up in Germany, that the Amazon was really far away. And as a kid, I had no idea 10 years later, I would end up in Tibet or then even in the Amazon looking back, I can see it. I always was fascinated, but it just happened along the way. So lucky.
Follow your passion and maybe make sure you're passionate about the process too of what you're doing, not just the final result.
You have to. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I hope 18-year-old Daniel would listen to that because I think it's hugely useful information. And then the final question, what do you hope is the lasting impact of your body of work? What do you hope the impact is that your work has?
Well, everything is impermanent. The only thing permanent is impermanence. And so who knows? But I think just as much as for me, the journey is really inspiring awe in nature, in the diversity of life, and how humanity is just a small part of it. And how we are part of it. That for us, there is no future unless we realize our place in the ecosystem. And as the Dalai Lama put it, we got to be smartly selfish, meaning we got to connect, we got to be, take care of each other and the environment. That is what sustains us. If it's just me, it's detrimental. What we get embodied right now in DC, that the only thing counts is me, and one country, and that's all foolish. That's not seeing how life works.
Yeah.
It's all interconnected, and that there's even such a thing as what we have just learned about the fungi in 1 or 2 generations, what they do, the services, and how much more there is to discover. It's just mind-blowing.
Well, even if it is impermanent, I think adding that effect to the inertia of pushing people to a greater connection with nature, adding to that cacophony of voices that is promoting that reconnection with nature, a less selfish outlook, is extremely noble and extremely necessary. Thank you very much. And I hope we can talk again here soon.
Thank you so much.